In the medium term, there will be a lot of chaos caused by the immediate end of the war. How do you begin to start sort of demilitarizing your economy? How do you incorporate back into society, tens, hundreds of thousands of battle-scarred soldiers who have been through this, phenomenally brutal war and are now coming home? And in the long term, I think this will be seen as a sort of disastrous act of hubris and maybe even the last gasp of real Russian imperialism. But maybe that's a little bit too optimistic a perspective.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. Today we're joined by Mark Galeotti, Director of the consultancy Mike Intelligence, a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and author of the book Forged in War, A Military History of Russia. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure.
To begin, Keir Starmer was in Ukraine yesterday, promising 100 years of support for Ukraine. Is that going to reassure Kiev ahead of Trump's inauguration?
Look, I'm tempted to damn it with faint praise and say every little bit helps. Firstly, it is significant that Keir Starmer finally went, after all, there had been quite a gap. And the Ukrainians had been quite critical, claiming that, in fact, the level of support had diminished since the elections. I think Starmer obviously had other priorities, but also wanted to go when he actually had something concrete to provide rather than just a photo opportunity. And this treaty, this 100-year friendship, in many ways, it's a repackaging of things that were already likely to be being provided. The sums involved aren't particularly high, though there is a commitment to continue £3 billion worth of military assistance every year for as long as it takes. But precisely because it takes place just before Trump's inauguration, I think that's the key thing. You have a lot of European leaders all trying separately to communicate to Kyiv that, yes, there's uncertainties about quite what's going to happen with American support, but that European support is not dependent on policy in Washington. Whether that's true, of course, will remain to be seen.
And Trump's team are still set on starting negotiations. In Russia's current position, do you think Putin is going to be happy with what he's managed to seize from Ukraine?
I'm not convinced that real negotiations, as opposed to a ceasefire, are very likely. I think at the moment Putin seems quite confident, cocky even. After all, his forces are continuing that they're slowly but surely driving the Ukrainians out of their Kursk salient. They are moving forward in the Donbass at massive cost, but nonetheless, momentum is on their side. And I could see a ceasefire, which is after all only just a sort of a temporary cessation of hostilities, as being something that's in Putin's interest. It allows him to regroup, and it gives him the initiative, because then he can decide if and when to restart actual hostilities when it's in his convenience. Actual negotiations, that I think we're a long way away from. Yes, of course, Trump has made all these pledges, but I think, as we've seen with the Gaza peace deal, a real negotiation is a complex, difficult, long-term process. And I think Trump's looking for a quick hit, quite frankly, sort of a nice, fancy opportunity to show that he's the deal maker supreme, rather than being willing to put time and political capital into long-term detailed negotiations. And I think the Russians are counting on that. So they might allow negotiations to start, just simply so that they don't look like they're the recalcitrant ones. But I'd be very surprised, delighted, but very surprised if Putin were actually serious about reaching a proper peace deal this year.
And Trump's team, as you say, are now admitting that a ceasefire could take months rather than the one day that Trump initially promised. But with the state of the Russian economy, can Putin wait that long?
And he can. This is the sad truth of the matter. The Russian economy is facing serious pressures. Absolutely. There's no question about that. But I think we sometimes exaggerate the potential impact of certain indices. For example, the ruble. The ruble is in decline. Well, that's not a big deal when you don't pay your soldiers in dollars or euros, when you don't buy your military equipment abroad. If anything, actually, it means that things like oil exports actually bring in more rubles now. The Russian economy is really facing stagflation. It's facing stagnation and high levels of inflation. That's bad for ordinary Russians, and in due course, that would be very scarring for the Russian economy. But although it's hard to be certain, I would say that Russia at least has another year in the tank before it has to start making really difficult guns versus butter type sort of decisions. So, look, although common sense would suggest that Putin needs a peace sooner rather than later, frankly, Putin's ideas of common sense may not be the same as ours.
Do you think Putin is ready then to call a mobilization, or do you think perhaps he doesn't yet need to?
He doesn't yet need to. I mean, at the moment, absolutely, casualties are outstripping recruitment. Broadly speaking, for every one soldier that the Russians are recruiting, they're losing two, dead or wounded. And this is obviously not sustainable in the long term. But I think the Russians at present were sort of very much working to the timeline of trying to ensure that by the time Trump comes into power, the position on the front line is as advantageous as possible. They can certainly scale down their offensive operations if they decide this is too much. And although 12,000 North Koreans just really a sort of a drop in the ocean, I mean, that's about what? 6 or 7 days worth of casualties, in effect. Nonetheless, I think it's also a way of signaling both the Russians themselves, but also Ukraine, that he has other ways of mobilizing troops. It's clear that Putin is still really worried about the prospect of another general mobilization. The first one was not only deeply discomforting for the Russian population, but for every soldier they actually managed to bring to arms, 2 to 3 Russians fled the country. So I think, at the moment, there are pressures, but if nothing else, Putin can count on the fact that it looks at the moment as if Russia is more able to replenish its forces than Ukraine.
And in your podcast, In Moscow's Shadows, you've been looking at Russian polling. What does the polling tell us about Putin's position and some of these pressures that you've been talking about there?
It's very interesting looking at opinion polling. I mean, some of this has been taking place inside Russia by companies that are based in Russia, some government, some independent, but also we have polling from agencies outside Russia that use internet and telephone means and so forth. And what's clear is that although on certain questions everyone knows the right answer to give, Putin's approval ratings remain sky high at levels that any Western politician would happily kill for. But nonetheless, as soon as you start to get into some of the detail, it is clear that actually people are willing to be relatively honest, and that the figures coming out from government and unofficial polling alike suggests, for example, that a majority of Russians now want to see negotiations. Now, we should be careful. Negotiations do not necessarily mean concessions. To many of those Russians, it's in some ways an opportunity for the Ukrainians to capitulate. So it's not exactly what we might think of as a sort of a level playing field. But nonetheless, if one looks at the trends, what is absolutely clear is that there is a growing degree of war weariness within Russia. And in particular, a sense that if Putin is willing to sign any kind of peace treaty, they will accept it. And I think it's ultimately that in some ways almost Putin will be the alibi. That sense of, well, if he's willing to accept it, then of course it's going to be fine. So whereas, say in late 2022, there were some people seriously saying Putin might be locked into a difficult position in that he needs to win a glorious triumph that justifies the blood and treasure he spent on this war. I think now there is a sufficient critical mass of people who are just fed up with the war and what it means for their lives. And so we'll go along with whatever peace Putin ends up initially.
So there is a sort of off-ramp from the war for Putin there, if you will. Does that leave him in a stronger position in 2025?
He is in some ways stronger, in some ways weaker, which is an incredibly unsatisfying answer to give. But let me just unpick that. I mean, he is stronger in the sense of, he does have continued advantages over Ukraine on the manpower issue. And although Ukraine is very well capitalized in financial terms now because of the various loans that have been provided, often based on the income from Russian funds which have been frozen in the West, money does not necessarily translate into combat power. So, I think we have to realize that the Russians are likely to feel as if they will continue to have the momentum on the battlefield. On the other hand, exactly, this is not necessarily sustainable in the longer term. It's one thing to say that the Russians still have at least a year's worth of manpower and money for this war. But the whole point is that actually this is having, in the long term, a dramatically scarring effect on the Russian economy, on Russian society, and the like. The problem, the big problem always with this, is knowing quite not just what Putin thinks, but how Putin is being briefed. What does he really know about the situation? It's fairly clear that in the economy, he's getting quite impatient with his technocrat managers, particularly Elvira Nabiullina, chairwoman of the Russian Central Bank. Now, Nabiullina is an outstanding financial operator. I mean, she has been sort of rated the best central banker in the world and so forth. And very much she was crucial in ensuring that sanctions did not tank the economy, as so many people had anticipated. But Putin is growing impatient. And the fact of the matter is, however good she is not a wizard able to just magically change the economy. If she were, then we should be hiring her. And I think increasingly we're seeing Putin begin to sort of become impatient with the limitations placed upon him. And this suggests that he's either not being briefed properly or he doesn't have a really good idea of not just how economies work, who does, but actually the constraints upon him. So I think the problem is that Putin may well think he's going into 2025 in a lot stronger position than he really is. And that's really what matters, because if he thinks that in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, he's going to be in an even better position to dictate terms to Ukraine, then unfortunately, he has no real incentive to end the war sooner.
One piece of frontline news that Putin will almost certainly be aware of is the reported capture of 2 North Korean soldiers in Kursk. Is this damaging for the Kremlin?
I mean, not really. Look, if you put soldiers into the field, no matter how well controlled and how heavily indoctrinated they are, you're going to have losses. You're going to have people being captured. And yes, on one level, it may be considered sort of marginally embarrassing, but frankly, embarrassing more for Pyongyang, I would suggest, rather than Moscow, particularly because, look, these are just ordinary soldiers. It's not as if they're going to have any great insight into sort of grand plans or the like. I think it's more that just simply one can understand why the Ukrainians want to make a big deal of this, because they really want to emphasize this point of the fact of the struggle against Russia is not just about Russia. It's about this whole axis of bad people. There's been so many different sort of formulations created, and particularly on the eve of the Trump inauguration, they're trying to give reasons why America should care about the Russo-Ukrainian war.
And Russian troops were reportedly under orders to kill injured DPRK soldiers to prevent their capture going public in Russia. But at the same time, Putin openly boasts of his alliance with Kim Jong-un. Why? Where's the link between these two? Why is he so keen to hide the fact that there are soldiers from North Korea fighting for Russia?
To be perfectly honest, I'm not actually convinced about some of the claims about Russians being told to kill wounded North Koreans, burning their faces off, and such like. Look, it's clear that there's been a certain amount of military tradecraft, issuing them with fake Russian uniforms and ammunition, identity papers, and so forth. But more broadly, rumours, the more lurid the better, will inevitably abound in this conflict. The fact of the matter is, exactly, Russia is making no bones about the fact that there are Korean troops. If you look at the Russian media, for example, they refer directly to this. And so, although I think probably the orders that Pyongyang has given its troops is death before dishonor, and we have had cases precisely of North Koreans killing themselves rather than letting themselves be captured. Maybe it's because of ideology. Maybe it's because they're worried about what might happen to their families back home. I mean, this is let's face it, the North Korean regime makes Putin's look positively humane. So, I mean, in that context, there's all sorts of reasons why we haven't had many captives, but I don't think it's because Russians have been gunning them down.
And what does the use of DPRK troops tell us about Putin's casualty problem? I mean, we know that it's not just soldiers from North Korea that have been brought in by Russia to join the fight.
Well, the interesting thing about the presence of North Koreans is actually the initiative seems to have come from Pyongyang. It's not that Putin was desperate for them. It's actually that Kim Jong Un offered them. I mean, not for free. I mean, these are in some ways to be considered state mercenaries. I mean, they're not pocketing much, but obviously Pyongyang is benefiting from that. There's a lot of overblown talk about this shows desperation and so forth on Putin's part. Well, I mean, it doesn't any more than the fact that the Ukrainians are relying on ammunition and kit from elsewhere. It's more that absolutely, at present, for political reasons, Putin, the one thing he really wants to do is to avoid mobilizing or having to send conscripts, 18, 19-year-olds into battle. So on the whole, he's still relying on volunteers attracted by pretty massive salaries and bonus payments. But on the other hand, absolutely, if he can recruit North Koreans or impoverish people from the global south, as has been happening, to help just simply meet up a little bit of the shortfall of manpower, why wouldn't he do that? It is ruthless, but in its own way, it is common sense.
And do we know much about what it is that North Korea are getting in return for these troops?
Well, we know it's things like fuel oils and wheat. After all, this is a country that seems to have sort of endemic problems with starvation and malnutrition, even amongst its soldiers, to be honest. Beyond that, it's clear that technology is part of the deal. And this is obviously where it's of much wider concern because of North Korea's continuing nuclear program. So far, it does not look as if the Russians are actually providing direct input into, for example, nuclear actual devices. Not least because that's something that probably Beijing would be very leery about. But on the other hand, the rocketry, actually the systems which would launch the nuclear devices, that is precisely one of the areas in which the Russians are providing assistance, especially because a lot of this is dual use. North Korea also wants to actually have a space program. It's tried launching satellites and so forth. And so the technologies that are useful for the space program, there is a clear overlap with those that are also useful for nuclear missiles. So that is the kind of area that definitely the Russians are providing.
And you mentioned China there. Is the relationship between North Korea and Russia going to be an issue for China? And more widely, are they going to be putting pressure on Putin to come to some sort of resolution or ceasefire in Ukraine this year?
I think at the moment, the Chinese perspective on the war as a whole seems to be they clearly don't want Putin to lose, but on the other hand, they don't necessarily care whether he wins or not. From their point of view, this war, however horrific it is, absolutely, nonetheless, it is quite useful. It is a massive distraction for the West. It is forcing them to spend assets on resources that are not necessarily geared for a potential conflict in and around Taiwan. It continues to open something of a wedge between the West and the global South. And this is allowing the Chinese to present themselves as the new reasonable global power. Look at the Russians, look at the Westerners involved in this sort of bitter dispute. They don't really care about you. We would love to actually see a new global order that isn't dominated by this kind of petty spats. There's all sorts of opportunities for Chinese sanctimoniousness to come out through their diplomacy, and it's working to a degree. So I think that, plus the fact that it actually means that Russia is spiraling closer and closer to vassal statehood, dependent as it is on Chinese banks, on Chinese dual-use technologies and such like. All of this means it's actually turned into quite a good war for Beijing. But on the specific point of the interactions, this sort of triangular relationship between Moscow, Pyongyang, and Beijing. Look, I don't think that this relationship between the Russians and the North Koreans would be developing if Beijing was at all unhappy with it. Both of them really need Beijing's approval a hell of a lot more than they need what the other can provide. And so in the future, this is something to watch, that precisely if, for example, this relationship gets a little bit too close for Beijing's comfort. But at present, look, if in some ways Moscow can take the pressure off North Korea, that's fine. Because the big nightmare that Beijing has is a total systemic collapse in North Korea and millions of refugees pouring across the border. So actually, if thanks to this war, Russia is helping feed North Korea, that's no bad thing.
And back in Europe, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has warned that Russia is planning acts of terror in his country and elsewhere. Are acts of Russian sabotage, though, likely to stop or slow if there is some sort of ceasefire in Ukraine?
I think we might see some slight sort of turning down of the dial. But look, we have to bear in mind that as far as Putin is concerned, he is in effect at war with the West. And what's happening in Ukraine is merely just a manifestation of that. He doesn't give the Ukrainians credit for being a truly sovereign nation. He regards them essentially as proxies of the West. I mean, it's very striking that, for example, recent operations in the Black Sea area, they very clearly said, well, it's all Britain's fault because Britain is the one that is essentially running Ukrainian operations in the Black Sea. So I think in that context, this campaign we've seen that's ranging from disinformation and cyber attack all the way through to arson, sabotage, and assassination, is, as far as the Russians are concerned, a way of trying to make Europe pay for its continued support for Ukraine, make Europeans feel that they have skin in the game and that this war really is affecting their lives. So if there is a ceasefire, we might see him being cautious enough to sort of scale down some of the more extreme examples, again, the sort of arson and assassination type things. But essentially, I think the sad truth of the matter is that so long as Putin is in the Kremlin, we are going to have to accept that the new normal is a continued low-level, covert, deniable campaign of attempts by the Russians to destabilize us, to exaggerate and exacerbate divisions within and between countries, and yes, from time to time, killing people that the Kremlin finds particularly annoying.
And do you think that threat is one that's really recognized by the incoming Trump administration?
I'm not convinced it is. And in part, it's precisely because the Russians have actually been quite clever in that, although, yes, we have seen attempts at a certain amount of kind of political subversion and interference and spread of disinformation inside the United States, they have held back from the more muscular manifestations of this policy. We haven't seen shopping malls being torched. We haven't seen attempts to derail trains and such like. Precisely because before the elections, they didn't want to really bring the spotlight on Russian activity. They didn't want to force Trump into a position in which he had to make a statement one way or the other. And likewise, now, so long as the Americans look as if they might actually be playing what, from Russians' point of view, is a useful role in Ukraine, it's unlikely that they're going to continue. This is essentially, at the moment at least, a European problem. And that's why it's for Europe, obviously broadly conceived, not just the EU, to really step up and deal with it, rather than relying on institutions like NATO, which are very much sort of shaped by American policy.
Uh, Iran and Russia have signed a foreign policy treaty that sort of dedicates sets the grounds for their cooperation into the future. Is that yet another sign that Putin's taking a much more long-term view of this conflict with this sort of US-led global order, regardless of the war in Ukraine, in a sense?
Well, yes, again, it reflects the fact that as far as he's concerned, that is the real war, his conflict with the West. And he knows, just as we have to be aware of this, he also knows that that's not going to change. It's not as though if there's peace in Ukraine, suddenly we will all re-embrace and it'll be back to the situation pre-2022 or indeed pre-2014. So, there will continue to be an antagonistic relationship. But also, if we look at, for example, his relationship with Iran, just as with North Korea, the question is always, how far did the initiative come from Moscow and how far does it come from its new allies? Because actually, a lot of this is pressure from other countries. In some ways, what they're trying to do is they're trying to lock Russia into long-term support of them. I mean, the North Korean treaty that was signed earlier actually formally commits Russia to defend North Korea if it's attacked. Now, no one's really imagining that North Korea is going to be invaded, or even, frankly, that the Russians would care that much if it was. But again, it's an attempt by Pyongyang to basically build an alliance that suits it. Likewise, the Iranians. I mean, from their point of view, they're frenemies. of Moscow's more than anything else. They're happy to support Moscow against the West. But if one looks at politics in the Middle East, often actually the Iranians and the Russians are competitors for influence. So again, they wanted to replace an existing treaty, which was just being sort of rolled forward, with a new one, because again, they wanted to establish the terms of that relationship to their advantage. So on one level, this is an advantage for Putin. It shows that he does have allies, and those allies are not impotent ones. But actually, it also shows the degree to which Putin himself is in a spot and is instead being forced to make deals that may not be to his advantage in the long term in order to secure benefits in the short term.
And just the final question to you, Mark. Your book, Putin's Wars, is releasing in Polish soon. If Putin is able or is forced to halt the war in 2025, how is Russia going to reflect on this conflict with Ukraine?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm sceptical that this year will see the end of the war, a proper end to the war, maybe a ceasefire. But as I say, I'd be delighted to be proven wrong on that. If it does, though, that the odds are in those circumstances, it would be a peace which would see Ukraine essentially sovereign, maybe under certain limitations like not joining NATO, and the Russians probably continuing to control the occupied territories, even if that's not legally recognized under international law. And in those circumstances, look, we know that Putin will make a grand song and dance about how this is a great triumph, that the Russian speakers of Ukraine have been protected from the neo-Nazis in Kiev, all this kind of nonsense. And it will be faithfully repeated in every state-controlled TV station, every state-controlled newspaper, and so forth. From ordinary Russians' point of view, I think the situation will be rather different. I think, it's clear that they didn't really care about the Donbass. Crimea, that was something that they genuinely thought was rightfully Russian. And Russians of every stamp. I mean, I remember I was living in Moscow for most of 2014, and it was striking how even people who were deeply opposed to Putin nonetheless approved of taking Crimea. The rest of Ukraine is very different. Russians essentially regarded the Ukrainians as cousins, but as a different country. Unlike Putin, they didn't think that Ukraine was just some portion of Russia that had just somehow historically gone astray. So I think there will be, in the short term, a lot of relief. In the medium term, there will be a lot of chaos caused by the immediate end of the war. How do you begin to start sort of demilitarizing your economy? How do you incorporate back into society tens, hundreds of thousands of battle-scarred soldiers who have been through this phenomenally brutal war and are now coming home? And in the long term, I think this will be seen as a sort of disastrous act of hubris and maybe even the sort of the last gasp of real Russian imperialism. But maybe that's a little bit too optimistic a perspective.
Mark Galeotti, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Glad to be here.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.